They had been told that Americans were soft, lazy, addicted to comfort, and incapable of sacrifice. They had been assured that the enemy across the Pacific lacked the discipline, the spiritual strength, the warrior spirit necessary to win a long and brutal war. But standing in the cold Michigan morning in the spring of 1945, Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omai felt something inside him break quietly, like ice cracking beneath feet that had walked too confidently across a frozen lake. It was not the guns or the ships or even the bombs that shattered his understanding of the world. It was the assembly lines. The Japanese naval officers had come as prisoners, yes, but also as witnesses to something their minds struggled to accept. Through factory windows smudged with industrial grime, past the armed guards who watched them with neither hatred nor pity but simple vigilance, they saw the impossible made ordinary. A bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes. Not every day, not every few hours. Every single hour, another complete aircraft emerged from the chaos of 10,000 moving parts and 10,000 moving hands, ready to carry death across the ocean to their homeland. And this was just one factory, in one city, in one nation that supposedly lacked the will to fight. Before we continue with this story that changed how an empire saw itself and the world, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this video right now? Are you learning something you never knew about history? If this story surprises you, if it makes you think, leave a comment below and tell us what shocked you most. And here's a fact that might surprise you even more than this story. 99% of people watching this video right now haven't subscribed to our channel. If you're part of that 99%, and you want more untold stories from history that challenge everything you thought you knew, click that subscribe button. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. Now, back to those Japanese officers standing in that factory, watching their certainty crumble with every plane that emerged, gleaming and deadly, from the American assembly lines. The journey to this moment of terrible understanding had begun months earlier, when these men were still warriors, still believers in victory, still certain that spirit could overcome material, that dedication could defeat production, that the soul of Japan could triumph over the soulless machinery of the West. They had flown missions where each plane was precious, where every loss meant weeks or months before a replacement arrived. They had watched their mechanics work through the night with hand tools and prayer, coaxing life from damaged engines, patching holes with whatever materials could be found, making one aircraft do the work of 3 because there were no others. In their training, they had learned that the American soldier was a creature of luxury, unwilling to endure hardship, quick to break when comfort was stripped away. The propaganda had been clear and confident. The enemy needed hot food and soft beds. The enemy required coffee and cigarettes and letters from home. The enemy would crumble under pressure because they had never known true sacrifice, never understood the purity of suffering for a cause greater than themselves. This was the bedrock of Japanese military doctrine in those years, the foundation upon which strategies were built and lives were spent. Bushido, the way of the warrior, would overcome industrial might. It had to. The alternative was unthinkable. But capture had brought them to America, and America had brought them face to face with a reality that made mockery of everything they had been taught. The transport ship had docked in California, and even that first glimpse through the porthole had unsettled them. The harbor was not merely busy, it was frenzied with purpose. Ships of every size crowded the water, loading and unloading with a rhythm that suggested not chaos but orchestration on a scale they had never imagined. Cranes swung cargo as if the boxes weighed nothing. Trucks lined up in formations that stretched beyond sight. And everywhere, there was abundance. Not the careful rationing of resources that characterized Japanese industry, not the make-do spirit that had become a virtue in Tokyo. Just abundance, careless and confident, as if the materials being loaded onto those ships were as infinite as the Pacific itself. The prisoner of war camp was not what they expected either. They had prepared themselves for brutality, for the treatment they knew prisoners received in Japanese hands, for beatings and starvation, and the systematic destruction of dignity. Instead, they found something more disturbing than cruelty. They found indifference mixed with a casual plenty that seemed almost insulting. The food was not good by any sophisticated measure, but there was so much of it. Bread that would have been treasured in Tokyo was consumed without thought. Meat appeared at meals with a regularity that seemed impossible. Coffee, real coffee, was available every morning. The guards were neither kind nor cruel. They simply did their job with the same matter-of-fact efficiency that characterized everything American, it seemed. It was not the comfort that broke them, but the carelessness of it. The waste they witnessed in those first weeks gnawed at something deep in their understanding of the war. Food scraped into trash bins, cigarettes lit and then abandoned after a few puffs. Equipment discarded not because it was broken, but because something newer had arrived. In Japan, every grain of rice was precious. Every bullet was accounted for. Every piece of equipment was maintained until it literally could not be repaired again, and then its parts were salvaged. Here, abundance had made people careless, yes, but that carelessness was itself a weapon. A nation that could afford to waste was a nation that could afford to fight forever. Then came the day they were told they would be taken on a tour. The American authorities wanted them to see something. The senior officers debated quietly among themselves what this might mean. Was it a propaganda exercise? Were they being taken to see staged displays meant to break their morale? Lieutenant Commander Omei, who had studied at Etajima Naval Academy and could read the currents of naval warfare, like his ancestors read the sea, felt a deep unease. The Americans did not need propaganda. That was the thought that kept circling through his mind. They did not need to stage anything. The factory in Willow Run, Michigan, stood like a monument to a god the Japanese officers did not worship. The building itself seemed impossible. It stretched across the landscape like a steel horizon, longer than anything they had seen outside of naval dockyards. The smell hit them first when they entered. That particular perfume of industry, hot metal and oil, ozone from welding torches, the sharp tang of paint and solvent, sweat and purpose all mixed together. The sound came next, a symphony of mechanical percussion that never stopped, never slowed, just maintained its relentless rhythm. Hammers and drills, conveyor belts, and human voices calling to each other over the din, metal meeting, metal with sparks and certainty. But it was the sight that truly unmade them. The assembly line stretched away into a distance that seemed to deny the limitations of space itself, and moving along that line, at a pace that seemed too fast to allow for quality yet somehow produced perfect results, were the bombers. B-24 Liberators, each one capable of carrying thousands of pounds of death to Japanese cities, each one a complex machine that would have taken Japanese industry months to produce. Here they came together in hours, not through any single heroic effort, but through the steady accumulation of 10,000 small tasks performed by 10,000 workers who looked nothing like warriors. There were women on the assembly line. This fact registered in the minds of the Japanese officers with particular force. Women wearing trousers and work boots, their hair tied back with practical kerchiefs, wielding tools with confident familiarity. They installed hydraulic systems and electrical wiring, riveted aluminum skin to frames, calibrated instruments with steady hands. In Japan, women served the war effort through sacrifice and support, through making do with less, through sending sons and husbands to die with proper ceremony. Here, women built the machines of war themselves. The contradiction was profound. The culture they had been taught to despise as weak placed its women in factories. The warriors of Japan kept their women safely distant from such masculine pursuits. Yet which nation was producing more weapons? An American foreman noticed the Japanese officers watching and walked over. He was in his 50s perhaps, with the thick hands of someone who had spent a lifetime working with tools. Through the translator, he explained the process with neither boasting nor apology, just simple pride in work done well. Each station had a specific task. Each worker knew their role precisely. The plane moved down the line, and piece by piece, system by system, it became whole. At the end of the line, engines roared to life for the first time. New pilots climbed into brand new aircraft and flew them away to training fields and then to war. 63 minutes. The foreman repeated the number as if it were ordinary. Every 63 minutes, another plane ready for combat. Omai did the mathematics in his head, unable to stop himself. If this factory produced one plane every hour, that was nearly 400 planes per week, more than 1,500 per month, from one factory. And he knew there were other factories. The intelligence reports that had reached Japan before his capture had mentioned Boeing plants in Seattle, consolidated factories in San Diego, Douglas facilities in California, each one producing hundreds of aircraft per month. The numbers became absurd, impossible, and yet here he stood watching the impossible happen with his own eyes. Japan's entire aircraft production in a good month might reach 1,000 planes. This single building in Michigan could nearly match that alone. It was not the technology that defeated understanding, but the scale. The Japanese knew how to build excellent aircraft. The Zero fighter had been superior to anything America fielded at the war's beginning. Japanese engineers understood aerodynamics and metallurgy. Japanese craftsmen could produce work of extraordinary precision. But Japanese industry produced planes the way artisans produced swords, each one receiving individual attention, each one built with care and skill that took time. What Omai saw before him was not craftsmanship but something else entirely. It was industrial warfare taken to a conclusion that Japanese military planners had never truly accepted. Quality mattered, yes, but quantity had a quality all its own. The officers were taken next to see the storage yards, and this proved even more devastating than the assembly lines. Rows upon rows of completed aircraft sat waiting for pilots, not dozens, hundreds, perhaps thousands, stretching across fields turned into temporary parking lots for weapons. These were not precious resources carefully hoarded. These were inventory, surplus, excess production waiting to be absorbed by a military machine that could apparently swallow infinite quantities of equipment and still demand more. In Japan, every plane that rolled off a production line was desperately needed immediately. Here, planes sat in fields because there were more planes than could be immediately distributed. A young guard, barely 20, offered them cigarettes during a break. He was from Iowa, he said through the translator, and before the war he had worked on his family's farm. The translator hesitated over some of his words, trying to find equivalents for the casual American slang. The young man seemed curious about the Japanese officers, asking questions about their country with genuine interest rather than hostility. Had they really flown aircraft carriers? What was Tokyo like? Did they have farms in Japan like the ones in Iowa? The questions were innocent, almost childlike, and this too was disturbing. This boy soldier did not hate them. He did not seem particularly interested in revenge or victory or any of the grand concepts that drove war. He was simply here, doing a job, waiting to go home. And somehow this indifference was more frightening than hatred would have been. The tour continued over several days, and each day brought new revelations that accumulated like weights on the chest until breathing became difficult. They saw tank factories where Sherman tanks rolled off production lines with the same relentless regularity as the aircraft. They saw shipyards where Liberty ships were being completed in weeks rather than the months or years such vessels would require in Japanese yards. They saw foundries producing steel in quantities that exceeded Japan's entire annual output in what appeared to be a single month's work. They saw warehouses stacked to the ceiling with spare parts, with ammunition, with food and fuel and every material necessary to sustain an army across an ocean. They saw a nation that had turned its entire industrial capacity toward war, but had done so without apparent strain, without the desperation that characterized Japan's war economy. In the evenings, back at the camp, the officers sat together in silence. Some wrote letters home, though they knew these letters would be read by censors and might never arrive. Others simply stared at nothing, processing what they had seen, trying to reconcile it with what they had believed. Omai found himself thinking about a conversation he had once had with his uncle, a businessman who had visited America before the war. His uncle had tried to explain the scale of American industry, but Omai, young and confident in Japanese superiority, had dismissed the warnings. Spirit would overcome material. Japan had defeated Russia in 1905 through superior fighting spirit, had they not? The samurai tradition ran deep in Japanese veins. Americans were merchants and farmers, not warriors. Soft, undisciplined, incapable of the sacrifices necessary for victory in modern war. But that understanding had been built on a fundamental misreading of what war had become. The wars of the past, where individual valor and tactical brilliance could overcome numerical disadvantage, had been made obsolete by the wars of the present. Modern war was not a duel between champions. It was a competition in industrial production, in resource extraction, in the ability to turn an entire society into a machine for producing weapons and moving them to the battlefield. Japan had approached World War II as if it were still fighting in 1905. America had understood that war in 1945 was about assembly lines. One of the younger officers, a pilot named Sakai who had survived combat over Guadalcanal before his capture, spoke quietly one night. He had shot down 7 American planes, he said, and felt pride in each victory. But for every plane he destroyed, he now realized America had built 10 more, 20 more. His victories had meant nothing. He had been fighting mathematics with courage, and mathematics always won in the end. The other officers nodded slowly. They had all performed acts of bravery, all sacrificed, all done their duty, and none of it had mattered because while they were being brave, America was being productive. The psychological weight of this understanding was crushing precisely because it could not be blamed on cowardice or failure. The Japanese military had fought with extraordinary courage. Japanese pilots had flown missions that American pilots called suicidal. Japanese soldiers had defended positions long past the point where defense was rational. The kamikaze attacks that had begun in late 1944 represented the ultimate expression of fighting spirit. Men turning themselves into weapons because weapons were scarce, but men willing to die were plentiful. None of it had been enough. None of it could ever be enough, because the war had never been about courage. It had been about capacity. Ome thought often about the assembly lines. The image haunted him, returned to him in quiet moments, invaded his dreams. Not because they were terrible, though their purpose was terrible enough, but because they were beautiful in their own way, beautiful in their efficiency, in their representation of human coordination on a scale he had never imagined possible. 10,000 workers, each performing a specific task, each task linking to the next, the whole system functioning with mechanical precision to produce complexity from simplicity. It was not heroic. No one would write poems about workers installing hydraulic systems or riveting aluminum panels, but it was effective in a way that transcended heroism. The Japanese military tradition celebrated the individual warrior, the ace pilot, the master swordsman whose skill elevated them above ordinary men. American industry celebrated the system, the process that made individual skill less necessary because the system itself guaranteed results. A factory worker in Willow Run did not need to be exceptional. They needed to be reliable, consistent, capable of performing their assigned task to specification. Excellence was built into the system rather than dependent on individual genius. This was a philosophical difference as much as an industrial one. Japan believed in the power of the exceptional individual. America believed in the power of the adequate system. And the adequate system, it turned out, could overwhelm exceptional individuals through simple arithmetic. A Japanese ace pilot might shoot down 20 American planes in their career. An American factory could produce 20 planes in a single day. Send enough adequate pilots in enough adequate planes, and eventually the ace would be overwhelmed not by superior skill but by superior numbers. It was not glorious. It was not the stuff of legend, but it was how modern war was won. The officers were shown other things during their captivity. They saw American cities untouched by bombing, thriving with civilian life that continued despite the war. They saw stores full of goods, rationed, yes, but still plentiful compared to what existed in Japan. They saw schools operating normally, and children playing in parks. They saw a nation at war that had not been consumed by war, that maintained something like normal life even as it produced weapons in quantities that seemed to defy physical law. Japan had been transformed entirely into a war machine, every resource dedicated to the fight, civilian suffering accepted as necessary for victory. Yet America, fighting a two-front war across two oceans, seemed to be doing so almost casually, with enough surplus capacity to maintain something resembling peace at home. This too was a weapon, though not one that could be mounted on a bomber or loaded into a gun. The psychological weapon of inexhaustible capacity, of an enemy that seemed to have more of everything and could replace losses faster than they accumulated. Japanese strategy had been built on the assumption that America would tire of the war, that the soft American public would demand peace once the casualties mounted, that a democracy could not sustain the will to fight across vast distances for years. But that strategy had misunderstood both democracy and American character. The democracy had allowed the mobilization of industrial might on a scale no totalitarian system had matched. And the American character, whatever else it might lack in Japanese eyes, clearly possessed the capacity for sustained, organized effort on a massive scale. There was a moment, several months into their captivity, when Omei was given permission to write a letter that would actually be sent to Japan through neutral channels. He sat with the blank paper before him, pen in hand, trying to decide what to say. How could he explain what he had seen in a way that would be believed? If he described the assembly lines, would his superiors think he was exaggerating to excuse his capture? If he gave the true production numbers, would they think he had been deceived by American propaganda? The truth was so far outside what Japanese military leadership believed possible that the truth itself seemed like a lie. In the end, he wrote simply and directly. He described the Willow Run factory. He gave the production numbers he had been told, and explained that he had personally witnessed them. He described the scale of American industrial capacity and stated his professional judgment that Japan could not win a war of production against such an enemy. He recommended peace negotiations while Japan still had any bargaining power, before the assembly lines produced enough weapons to destroy every city and kill every soldier. He folded the letter carefully, knowing it would be read by censors on both sides, knowing it might never reach its intended recipient, knowing that even if it did, it might be dismissed as the broken thinking of a defeated man. The letter did reach Japan, eventually. It was one of many such letters, many such reports from prisoners and attachés and anyone who had seen American industry firsthand. But reports that contradicted established doctrine were dangerous things. They implied that the war was unwinnable, and to suggest the war was unwinnable was to suggest that the sacrifices already made had been meaningless. So the reports were filed away, or quietly suppressed, or reinterpreted to fit existing beliefs. The assembly lines kept producing, the bombers kept flying, the war ground on toward its inevitable conclusion. Years later, after the surrender, after the occupation, after Japan began rebuilding itself from ruins, some of those reports would be recovered and read with new eyes. Historians would wonder what might have been different if the Japanese leadership had accepted the truth earlier, had understood that spirit could not overcome industrial mathematics, had chosen peace when peace was still possible on better terms. But such questions assumed a rationality that did not exist in the moment, a willingness to accept unpleasant truths that human nature generally resists until resistance becomes impossible. Omei survived the war, returned to Japan, and spent decades afterward teaching at military academies and writing about naval strategy. In his writings, he returned again and again to the assembly lines, to that moment of understanding in the Michigan Spring when everything he believed about the war inverted itself. It was not the bombs that had defeated Japan, he argued, though the bombs had certainly ended it. It was not the battles, though the battles had been lost. It was the assembly lines. The war had been lost the moment it began, lost in the mathematics of industrial production, lost because Japan had started a fight with an opponent whose capacity to produce weapons exceeded Japan's capacity to destroy them. Every Japanese victory had merely delayed the inevitable. Every act of courage, every sacrifice, every kamikaze pilot who flew their final mission had been ultimately meaningless against the simple fact of American industrial superiority. This was the bitter truth that haunted him, that haunted many of the officers who had seen what he had seen. Their courage had not been lacking. Their dedication had not failed. They had simply been on the wrong side of an equation that no amount of fighting spirit could balance. Modern war rewarded not the brave, but the productive. It rewarded systems over heroes, factories over warriors, assembly lines over honor. This was the nature of industrial warfare. And Japan had entered industrial warfare with a feudal mindset, expecting samurai virtues to overcome manufacturing capacity. The assembly lines had taught them otherwise, but the lesson came too late and at too high a cost. Standing in that factory in spring 1945, watching another bomber roll off the line precisely on schedule, Omei had felt his understanding of the world shift fundamentally. He had been raised to believe that spirit was paramount, that will could overcome material obstacles, that the warrior's heart mattered more than the merchant's calculator. The assembly line revealed these beliefs as beautiful lies, comforting myths that had sent millions to die in a war that mathematics had already decided. It was not a lesson anyone wanted to learn, but it was a lesson that, once learned, could not be unlearned. The workers who built those planes probably never thought about the psychological impact of their work. They clocked in, performed their tasks, collected their paychecks, and went home to families and lives that continued despite the war. They were not warriors. They did not think of themselves as weapons, but in their aggregate, in their systematic coordination, in their reliable appearance day after day to perform repetitive tasks with adequate competence, they won the war as surely as any general or any battle. They were the assembly line, and the assembly line was the weapon that could not be defeated because it could not be discouraged or frightened or made to doubt. It simply produced relentlessly until there was nothing left to fight against its products. This is what Japan discovered too late. Not that Americans were braver or smarter or more dedicated than they had imagined, but that Americans had built a system that made individual bravery and intelligence and dedication less critical than collective capacity. The assembly line was democratic in a way warfare had never been before. It did not require heroes. It required only enough people willing to do adequate work consistently. And this adequacy, when multiplied by millions of workers across hundreds of factories, became unstoppable, not through any single moment of glory, but through the steady accumulation of production that buried its enemies under an avalanche of material. The bombers that rolled off the line at Willow Run carried with them the death of an old understanding of war. War would never again be primarily about courage or honor or fighting spirit, though these things would always matter. War had become, irrevocably, about industrial capacity and resource management and supply chains. The nation that could produce the most weapons, move them most efficiently to the battlefield, and replace losses most quickly would win, regardless of the bravery of individual soldiers. This was the new reality, visible in every plane that emerged from the assembly line, and Japan had learned it through a harsh teacher that accepted no excuses and gave no second chances. And there are thousands more stories like this waiting to be remembered, moments when the course of history turned not on battlefields but in factories, not through heroic charges but through quiet acts of production, when the true nature of power revealed itself to those who had misunderstood it until understanding came too late to matter.